Episode 77 of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Insulin, makers of the OmniPod, the world's only tubeless insulin pump. With so much talk in the news about EpiPen pricing and now insulin costs, I thought this is the right time to talk to Anthony DiFranco. I heard you sit in your car. You just said, who? Anthony DiFranco. What does that mean? Anthony is a Yale grad. He is a super smart guy. He is a motivated gentleman. He's also got the spirit of a young man, of an inventor, of a scientist, and he wants to make the world a better place. He also has type 1 diabetes, and he's trying to make insulin by himself in a laboratory. Well, not by himself. There's something called the Open Insulin Project. There's a group of people in a lab that's crowdsourced trying to make insulin. That sounded like an interesting conversation to have, especially with what's going on in the world today. Our conversation, it just got deeper than I thought it was. We started talking about the idea of making insulin and kind of the real scientific nuts and bolts and the patent ideas and, all the intricacies of it. Our conversation quickly switched and we just started talking more about the ideas behind it, more about the community and the people. And I even sort of played devil's advocate and argued both sides because I have to admit, I also understand companies trying to make a profit, and I understand you not wanting your life to be about profit. So there's a lot of different aspects to this conversation, and Anthony and I did a pretty good job of talking about most of them. Let's see what you think.
My name is Anthony Di Franco. I've been working on the Open Insulin Project at Counterculture Labs in Oakland for about a year. I have type 1 diabetes myself, which is one of the reasons that it's an interesting question to work on for me. I was diagnosed with it about 10 years ago.
So you in your early 30s?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the Open Insulin Project that's a fascinating idea. So tell me what that is.
So in Counterculture Labs, first of all, is a hacker space focusing on biohacking. So people interested in biotechnology and bringing in the knowledge and the tools of biotechnology to the people, so to speak, letting people tinker with things that they're interested in and solve their own problems with these tools.
Anthony, people who are reasonably qualified to do those things, or like, can I come in and try to turn myself into Spider-Man, or what's the parameters?
Everything that happens is kind of bounded by how biology works. So I suppose you could come in and say that you wanted to try to turn yourself into Spider-Man, and then you would get into some discussions about how that would be pretty difficult, and if you didn't get the message, then people might think that it wasn't worth spending time trying to help you out.
So the collective group has conversations about all ideas that come in.
Yeah, the way that people work on an idea is basically that they put out a call to the group that they want to work on a certain project, and then others will come and if they're interested, try to help out.
Okay.
So if no one is interested, then
you don't get a response.
Yeah, you can try to. I suppose you could try to go it alone. No one ever has, because that's really too difficult for something like this.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's kind of a built-in informal vetting process just in how things work, and there are some guidelines on whether you can do anything actually dangerous, just to say you can't. So there are these biosafety level guidelines that are kind of a de facto standard in industry and academia, and we follow those. So you can't work with pathogens, you can't work with mammalian cells yet, but you can certainly do things in E. coli and yeast, and the Open Insulin Project. That's plenty. For the vegan cheese project that is also going on, that is plenty. Um, so those projects have gotten interest, and they fall within the safety guidelines.
So in this same space, there's a group working on trying to develop insulin, and there's a group working on trying to develop vegan cheese.
Yeah, there's those two groups, and there's another group working on a bacterial sunscreen. So that's going to try to get E. coli to express uh, ultraviolet absorbing proteins.
Wow,
And uh,
that's amazing.
the
Okay,
yeah,
jeez.
well, the
You just
project's also not just in our space, but there are a lot of collaborations between our space and BioCurious, which is down in Sunnyvale.
okay. So even from lab to lab, there's connections.
Yeah.
Really amazing.
So yeah, the community is pretty
big.
Yeah. Well, it's big, but also there's some, to some degree, everyone knows everyone else, so it's like a big small world.
So let me ask you one question before we kind of jump into the idea of your insulin project, because I've spoken to people in the past who take something that pre-exists and they tinker with it to change it or to make it work better for them. They don't appreciate the word hackers, but you guys use the word hackers. So I don't personally care one way or the other. I'm just, how come you guys are comfortable with it? What is it about what you're doing?
For me, it was something that ever since I was very young, I was comfortable with. I grew up in suburban Cleveland, so it was pretty far removed from any kind of action, especially back in the '90s when the internet was, the web barely existed. But I was also very interested in computers, in part because it could connect you to this broader world of everything that was going on. So I got into computer culture, and I saw um, this magazine called 2600 The Hacker Quarterly, and I said, "Oh, that sounds cool, and maybe I can learn about things I'm interested there." And they had editorials that would talk about hacker culture and hacker values, and they pointed me in the direction of some even older documents, like the Hackers Dictionary and the exploits of the hackers at MIT, going back now like 40, 50 years. Um, so that was what defined to me what it meant to be a hacker, was what it meant to the early pioneers of computing, which is not someone who had any kind of malicious intent, but was just someone who understood things at a deep level and uh, could go beneath the surface to accomplish things that others couldn't.
You're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in your 20s, and you're going along. What were you doing then? Were you in
Well,
grad
actually,
school? Were you
yeah, it was still in college. It was literally my last semester during my undergraduate.
okay?
So
And what was your degree? What was your undergrad degree in, and where'd you go?
I was at Yale, and I studied computer science and math and physics. And
Okay, I was gonna go to Yale, but they didn't want me to come.
I should have asked nicely.
I should see. I probably went about it all wrong.
Yeah.
When you when you get out of Yale with that degree, I'm assuming you continue on to grad school.
Well, it was a little bit interesting for me because I was accepted by uh, the robotics program, a robotics lab at the computer science program at Carnegie Mellon. I was really eager to go, but then I found at the last minute that I didn't have any funding, and I would need to have gotten my own funding to actually go to grad school, even though I was accepted. So it was a bit of a surprise for me. And also, I had just had untreated diabetes for 6 months, so I wasn't in the best of health, and I wasn't entirely on top of this task of going and getting my own funding, and it
Yeah.
kind of fell through at the last minute. So um, I ended up looking for a job, and that's ultimately how I ended up to moving to the Bay Area.
There are a number of companies that make insulin that all, by all accounts, work as well as any insulin that's ever been on the planet so far, and it's really expensive, and not everyone can afford it. And I'm assuming is that what led you into this idea? Is the idea that there are a lot of people around the world who don't have access to insulin?
Um, well, oddly enough, that came a little bit after we had uh, decided to try to make insulin. Then we were trying to see like, well, who might be interested in helping us. And I kind of had a vague sense that there might be problems with access to insulin, but I had no idea the extent of the issue.
You have
Initially,
insurance, and
yeah,
it hasn't been an issue for you in your life. It
yeah.
hasn't never been an issue for us either.
Well, I've noticed that it's really expensive. If I look at the bill and what it would have cost me before insurance, it's like a staggering number, but I've never actually had to pay that, so I assume that it was just part of the normal bullshit of how um
How they make how everyone makes their money.
yeah, exactly. And how
Your hospital stay was $9 million. Your portion 45.
yeah.
Yeah, that
And
idea.
so I'm used to being an excuse for someone to move money from one column of a ledger over to another, and like I'm just the middleman, and none of that ever really touches me. But then after we'd started the project, we discovered that not everyone has the kind of magical status that just makes things happen behind the scenes and makes them work out.
Right.
So, but anyway, the way we got started on it is so I'm in the Bay Area. I'm interested in uh, hacking, and people are founding these things called hacker spaces. That sounds like my kind of place. So, um, and simultaneously, I was also interested in um, uh, economic alternatives and community currencies in particular. And so I went out to some of those meetups. I led a reading group about food-backed currencies for a while, and a lot of those people were kind of savvy activist types, and they also turned up in the hackerspace. And so I thought, all right, this is really interesting. This is a couple different important things coming together, and there's like uh, a combination of like the technical goals of people in hackerspaces with the social goals and social concerns. So uh, that was especially interesting. And then a group got together to found a hackerspace in Oakland, which is close to where I live in Berkeley. So I was very interested in helping out with that. That was called Pseudo Room, and that was more like as far as the hacking goes, it was more focused on like computers and electronics. So more your standard hackerspace. But then some of those people and some other people wanted to found a biohacking space, and that was also, of course, really interesting to me because simultaneously pretty I'm tinkering around with a lot of different ways to treat my diabetes. I got an insulin pump, I got a jet injector. I'm reading about all these different kinds of things, and of course, being of a hacker mind, I'm interested in maybe building my own things because I noticed that all this stuff is very proprietary. A friend of mine introduced me to Barnaby Jack, also, who is a security researcher who was working on insulin pumps, um, and uh, he basically found out that with a major brand of insulin pump, it is very easy to wirelessly control all of the features of it without knowing anything specific to the pump, like the serial number. Like basically, they just didn't put the security in. That also opened my eyes to the idea that um, if you someone with the knowledge could make a really important contribution and advance things past what all of these weird um, bureaucratic and economic constraints on the institutional actors allow. I went to the hackerspace and I was kind of asking around and saying, hey, might anyone want to be interested in working on like an open hardware, open software insulin pump? And I was going around asking people about that a lot. I was also looking into um, uh, ways to measure glucose that wouldn't use consumable supplies. So ways to administer it, ways to administer insulin, ways to measure blood glucose that didn't require consumable supplies, because that was a big frustration, is that I've got this waste train going by me every day, and every little thing that I'm using up and throwing away has a little price tag attached to it, and I'm very aware of that. And um, I don't want to create this waste. I don't want to spend this money, and this money might be prohibitive to someone else, of course, doesn't have it to spend. So I was looking into jet injectors. I was looking into um, radio frequency spectroscopy for measuring blood glucose. Just throwing those ideas out there in the hackerspace to anyone who would listen. And some of the biohackers were people of a biohacking bent, were interested in that sort of thing. And eventually, well, after that, some people's attention turned to making the insulin itself. And initially, I wasn't that interested in making the insulin itself because it's pretty easy to get the insulin, and it seemed to me like it would be kind of hard to make it versus buying it.
Right, and it also doesn't fix a problem as a waste trail. It wasn't where your mind was, I guess, in that space.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that shipping all of this stuff around from these centralized distribution points in refrigerated trucks isn't the most efficient way to do it necessarily. And it also that is one of the main barriers to access to insulin in places that don't have good infrastructure that can support this supply chain.
Keep it cold and support it and move it around. Yeah. How about that?
So, and that ties into another theme that came up in the the economic alternative economics groups I was a part of, and people who were into like decentralized peer-to-peer infrastructure. Like, it turns out that running these really long supply chains from these centralized distribution points is just very economically inefficient, and a big part of the reason why it happens is that it is subsidized in various ways. Like, it doesn't make economic sense to just make stuff in one big factory and then ship it all around the world versus having lots of little factories that would be closer to the point of use. So that was also something that started to work its way into this picture around insulin that was developing in my mind. So eventually,
so are you making insulin? I mean, obviously you can't copy somebody's. I'm assuming recipe is still a word you would use, but you can't use someone's formula, and so you start from scratch. And are you using the same ingredients, the same processes, or did you just completely start new?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question. So, well, the first thing that we were trying that came out of the talks that were specifically about making insulin was to make a bioreactor, basically just like a fermenting machine that has provisions to like control the temperature and the pH and other things that are important to the yeast growing. And you would like load your yeast in, and the yeast would have the insulin gene, and maybe you would have it would put a tag on the insulin protein that would instruct the machinery of the cell to excrete the yeast out of the cells, and then maybe you could try to purify it from that solution that the yeast is growing in. So that was the first idea for how to make insulin. That encompasses part of how someone makes insulin industry, which is the process control part, I guess. Then we found that there was this other part that we weren't paying attention to that was really important, which is what kind of a gene do you actually introduce? What kind of modifications to the organism do you actually make such that it produces insulin? Which organism do you use? How specifically do you purify the insulin? How do you get it out? How do you purify it? So then we decided that actually it was premature to think about automating something that we didn't know what it was we were automating. So we switched the focus to these questions that you just mentioned, which is, what is the recipe in the first place? And so then made the acquaintance through this network of people who were interested in insulin of Isaac Yonemoto, who currently he's working on open source cancer treatments. In the past, he had done work in an academic setting with insulin. So he was able to give us a quick overview of how it's produced, what the issues are in producing it that is potentially difficult, some sense of how the different major pharmaceutical companies differ in how they produce it, and what we might try to successfully produce it in our small scale setting with restricted resources. So that pretty much gave us the knowledge we needed to go ahead and try to figure out our own recipe for this. And there's also a lot of existing literature, and for that we had to take into account some of these concerns that you mentioned, which is some aspect of some process patented or otherwise. And a patent isn't a barrier to doing something for research purposes, but it is a barrier to producing it for other people to use. Since we had simultaneously been learning that this question of access to insulin is, a big important one, we thought whatever we did, we should try to do it such that other people could hypothetically use the product in the end. Of course, there's a lot of steps in between working out a new protocol that we hope would be simpler and having that become a commercial product. And some of those reasons are totally legitimate issues of safety and efficacy, and some of them are just a huge set of layers of bureaucracy that are imposed on top of those questions. And between the two, we decided we would just focus on testing an idea we had for making the insulin in E. coli in the simplest possible way we could think of, and then refer to the existing literature on how you make insulin in E. coli, and for all the steps that we weren't specifying and thinking of trying to innovate on, and looking at literature that was old enough that there probably wouldn't be patent questions. It's very hard to be sure about whether there are patent questions or not, because it's a very complex area of law, and I think ultimately that would also be something where we'd have to get an expert to look at it if there was a more concrete reason to have a closer look.
Plus, I would imagine that people who have patents on those processes aren't making them. I mean, do they have to be shared? I guess because they're patented. Are you able to see them, or is that?
Well, theoretically, that's the whole reason, or one of the main reasons that patents exist, is to get people to publicly disclose their invention. So that's what a patent application is it's supposed to be this public disclosure of your invention that is sufficiently detailed that someone else could reproduce it. And the idea was that you would be given a monopoly for a very limited time, and in return you would have to publicly disclose your invention. And then once your monopoly expired, which was supposed to be soon after the patent was granted, then everyone else would be able to compete with you and produce it. And so it's supposed to be a net economic gain. It's supposed to be a net increase in the competitiveness of the market. Sadly, that's not how it really ended up working out, because the term kept getting extended, and the producers started to collude around, like hoarding up patents that they could threaten each other with, and it ended up forcing smaller players out of markets that have a lot of patents in them entirely. And so it just became this really strong force for creating monopolies and oligopolies and centralizing markets. So
You just sort of broke my heart a little bit, because now I'm recognizing that old Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial where they said the recipe for the chicken was locked in a safe. It's not. It's public. I could figure out how to make that chicken right now if I
well, I
wanted
don't know.
to.
A trade secret is different from a patent. So a trade secret is something that a company decides not to publicly disclose, and for some reason, these have legal protections too. Uh, so, and that's like, it's really interesting, because it's like another tactic that a company can employ to prevent people from competing with it. Um, that like doesn't even pretend to have any kind of public good uh, in mind, and how it works. It's just like, yeah, you're a company, you can keep secrets, and the law will help you do that. And so I think that's one of these things. Earlier, I was talking about, subsidies to the centralization of the economy, where it might not be economical to have things be as centralized as they are, but uh, institutions help out, and I think that's definitely one of them. And the patent system is
So
one of them.
how far into the First of all, this is fantastic. I love talking to you, because this is like we're like the Goofus and Gallant of intelligence. I ask you a stupid question, and for 5 minutes you answer it really well thought out and intelligently. So,
Well, it's only because I've been hanging out with these nerds for 10 years, and we've been talking about this stuff, that I have any idea. And regardless of that, like, we're still so far away from being able to actually navigate the specific complexities of something like the patent system, that, because it's interesting, yeah, but it's like we still have a long way to go to.
so then let me theorize and ask a question for a second. So you start out with a bunch of well-intended people in a small, like, crowd-funded lab trying to make insulin, in a way that is different and new, and maybe would make it possible for people to make in smaller labs around the world, so there wouldn't be infrastructure problems around moving the insulin to people who need it. But is the irony that if you figured out how to do it, that you'd have to become a multi-billion-dollar corporation to get it accomplished? Do you think you'd end up becoming the thing you're working around at the moment?
Well,
And because of the way the system's set up, would it almost be necessary for that to happen?
well,
I don't want to break your
that's a
heart.
good question, but I don't. So I think if our work is going to in any way be the basis of a product, we're not going to be the ones to directly manufacture it. It's not completely out of the question, but as we've both kind of alluded to, like, setting up a company that complies with all the regulations takes an enormous amount of effort and capital, and that is
Right.
part of what makes the market not a competitive market. So
So if you got to that spot, you would need someone to come in who was big enough, but not too big, to want to take that idea and move it to the next level.
yeah, and that's basically
Yeah.
generics manufacturers.
Okay.
And it's a little. This is where it's a little dicey, because it's not like a generics manufacturer couldn't work this out on their own. So, and we're seeing with the EpiPen coverage and all of the scrutiny that's going on in generics now, that we're reminded of the fact that big companies can actually bribe smaller companies to not compete with them, and this is I believe this is protected by the law. This is not seen as an anti-competitive measure, which is probably has at least a few economists rolling in their graves right now, like the idea that a big player in a market bribing a small player in a market to not compete with them is not
just to say, look, here, we're going
totally
to
on the up and up.
give you some money and don't do this. Yeah. You know, I always wonder if it's a wives' tale, that story of so long ago that a gentleman invented a light bulb that wouldn't burn out, and General Electric had him come in for a meeting, had him bring in all of his plans and all of his drawings and all of his light bulbs, and they bought it from him and destroyed it all right in front of him before he left the room. I always wonder if that's a wives' tale or if that's really something that happened.
Yeah. If it's not literally
it's
true, I think
idea.
it's a good metaphor for how a lot of things work. So,
right, because that really becomes interesting. Because if you got to a point where it was a scalable, sellable idea, you I'm assuming because of where you started and what your goal is, you'd want to make sure it got brought to market. But how do you even know that you're selling it to the right person in that spot, like to the right entity, to a company who's really going to take your baby and move it along the way it needs to be raised? It's such a oh my God. I don't. All right, listen, let's get off of that because it's breaking my heart a little bit. So, So how far have you come? Have you made insulin?
The system steals your babies from you is the bottom line, I guess. Yeah. So
that's the name of this episode. The system steals your babies. But so have you made insulin? Have you ever brought your own blood sugar down with something you've created? All right, let's take a break from this futuristic talk about Anthony and him one day making insulin in his kitchen with something similar to a bread machine or a food processor, and talk about today, the now, the right now, the how to stay healthy today. I'm going to mention this again because I think it just makes the point so well. Arden's latest endocrinologist appointment, her A1C was 5.7. Standard deviation is fantastic. No crazy highs, no crazy lows, a nice steady blood sugar. How does that happen? Well, it happens with fine-tuning insulin. It happens when you understand how insulin works in your body and when you understand the timing of the insulin. You know, little boluses here, little bumps and basal rates there, little bolus, little basal, little bolus, little basal. It's a give and take. It's a process. It's a daily adjustment. Sometimes it's an hourly adjustment. So you kind of just can't make these adjustments, with injections. I mean, I guess you could if you want to inject yourself a ton of times, but if you saw how many times Arden gets insulin during the day, or how many times we make small adjustments to basal rates, you would see that it's a lot easier with an insulin pump. The OmniPod insulin pump makes it even that much better. Why? Because it's tubeless, because it doesn't have to disconnect for activities, or showering, or swimming, or, sports. So you're constantly 24 hours a day able to make these small adjustments that keep your blood sugar stable, steady, and where you want it to be. I'm telling you right now, my daughter's A1C is never, ever going to be a 5.7 without the technology that we use today. It is a huge part due to the OmniPod. Just go to my&nbsp.com/demo to try a free, no obligation, non-functioning pod today. You try it on, you'll see how you like it, you'll see you do like it, and then you'll make the switch. my&nbsp.com/demo, or the links in your show notes. Do you remember the last question I asked Anthony? Have you ever injected insulin that you've made into yourself?
Oh, no.
Not even close.
A long time before I ever even considered injecting myself with something that came out of my own efforts.
Yeah.
But,
well, and it wouldn't be. It's not even legal, right? To do something like you couldn't use it anyway.
Well, I don't know. I think if I made it and I use it and no one else is involved, it might be fine. Or at least, I think there was. I'm not sure how the law works, or the law might even contradict itself on this point, which it often does. But I think there was a public remark by an FDA regulator at like a biohacking conference where he said, we don't care about people doing things to themselves. We regulate the market, so we become interested when you're trying to put things out for the public to use.
Well, not to oversimplify and to stick with our Spider-Man concept from earlier, but I do want to caution you that Harry Osborn was at some point just a good guy who wanted to see if his Green Goblin formula worked, and so I do want you to be very careful, Anthony. And I had to dumb it down a little bit here, so so I could feel better about the conversation for a second. Yeah, your yell hits me right in the face once in a while you're talking. I was like, wow, I thought I was bright, and then Anthony started talking, and now I realize
Oh
I'm like an
no.
average
Am
guy.
I using
Not,
am I using SAT words on you?
no, it's not that. It's
Or...
and see, you probably don't. To get off topic for a second, you probably don't hear it, but your thoughts are very clear and linear, and when you speak, it's so obvious that you understand from soup to nuts exactly what you're talking about and all of the effects that come in from around that subject. It's I don't know how many people you talk to who aren't like you in the course of a day, but sometimes words just come out of my mouth, and then later I think, huh, that didn't really have any purpose. But you in this situation, and maybe listen, maybe I get you at home, I pull out a PlayStation and a six pack, and maybe you don't make any sense either. I don't know, but your mind works in a very specific way that I imagine lends to the things that you love to do, and probably is what got you looking for hacker magazines when you were a kid. But it's really interesting to hear you speak because you're not telling a story, you're recanting steps, and there's a difference, and it's very interesting. So I appreciate it. But you just reminded me that I'm not very bright.
No, I mean, I think a lot of it is just that I've had to understand this very clearly in order to talk about it with other people and not completely waste their time. And so I've tried to, get a clear sense of how everything works beforehand before I go on your podcast.
No, I appreciate that. So, no, I really appreciate it. Trust me, you've prepared way more than I did.
Did not have if I had a six pack before this podcast, I probably would not be making as much sense. So
well, maybe we'll try.
You were right about
maybe we'll try that one time, Anthony. So, okay. So
anyway, so have we made insulin? No. Here's what we've done. So we decided we would just start with the normal, the gene that produces insulin in humans exactly as it is in humans. And then we have some ideas for how we might tinker with that in the future to make it easier to produce. But right now we're just working with it straight out of humans. And taking that, we're putting it into a plasmid, which is a circular piece of DNA that bacteria can use, and we're putting that into E. coli, and we're growing up the E. coli. We're inducing them to express the insulin, and we're trying to purify the proinsulin. We're trying to purify that out and see if we've actually done that, because that's the first step that we need to do before we can do anything else. So this is just kind of shaking down our technique and our equipment in the lab and going through the basic steps that we need to go through that we need to use to build on everything else that we want to do on. So we have done that. Has been what we've been doing for most of the past year, is going through iterations of that and finding problems and starting back over from the beginning. So
a year. You've been at it for a year. Are you
most of a year? I think we really started the lab work in like January.
Are we talking about every day, like a full-time job, or is this something you do in your spare time? How does that work?
So I have other work to do, and everyone else does as well, and that's part of what has made it difficult to make progress. I mean, I've talked to people who have worked in academic labs, and they've said that the rate that we're making progress at is actually pretty comparable to what they've seen. So that's encouraging. But just looking at it from our perspective, the most talented and experienced people in the techniques that we're using are people whose skills are in high demand. So often they have jobs, and if they don't at the time, then they're going to go get one very soon because a lot of people are interested in working with them. So
well, is that sort of a sideways goal of yours? Like, are you hoping someone kind of like in academia comes by and says, hey, this is a great idea, we'd like to take it in-house and fund it?
Well, there are some hints that we might be able to collaborate with people in academic labs. So we're still trying to figure that out. But hopefully, yes. It would be great if this collaboration became bigger and uh, more people got involved in our project, and if multiple independent efforts sprang up around the idea, all of those things would be awesome. And I'm trying to do whatever I can to help that along. So um, that that's something we're still working on. And meanwhile, in the lab, we're working on just the basics. And we want to hit this first milestone of making the human pro-insulin, and then just to clarify, pro-insulin is the protein that is coded for directly by the insulin gene, and when it comes right out of the ribosome, in order to turn that protein into the actual active form of insulin, um, a couple other things need to happen. Some enzymes need to float by and cut out the middle part and bring the two ends of it together in a specific way, and then you have actual insulin. So the middle part is the C-peptide, which is used. That's what they're testing for to see if you have type 1 diabetes, is if you have no C-peptide, then they know that you aren't producing insulin. So you may have heard of it because of that. And there's some speculation that it might have some role in making you healthier in some way. But
so I've heard,
as far as anyone,
Anthony, let me just say, an older gentleman who I've spoken to in the past said that the C-peptide doesn't exist in man-made insulin anymore, but it did at one point, and that he felt that there was a decline in his overall health after that switch in insulin happened. And he doesn't base it on any, study or anything like that. It's a feeling he had about his own life. And it's interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting and I know that some people like animal insulin better, and I don't know if those keep the C-peptide or not, but they might. But yeah, so that was another thing that I was actually interested in. This is a long time ago. It was one of the things that got me interested in it, was that if we were making our own insulin, we could keep the C-peptide or something. Actually, now that I look at the details, it might be a fair amount of trouble to do that, but something we could try, have control over the process.
It's interesting. So the last year has just shown you, just from our quick conversation here, that you could see why C-peptide might have been removed from man-made insulin. It adds to the process, to the problem of the process.
Well, if we weren't like a ragtag group of rogues in an old bocce court in Oakland trying to make insulin, like it would be a lot harder to justify skipping including it, I think, because the marginal cost of the drug itself is minuscule. It's hard to say how close to zero, but I think it's zero for all practical purposes. So to put the C-peptide in, I don't think that would really change anyone's bottom line very much, especially given these insane margins that they have complete control over, where they could just change the price whenever they feel like it. So
it makes me wonder too, because we were talking about before how a drug eventually does go off patent, it goes to generic, and then the company it's funny, Anthony, because I see both sides of it. I wish insulin was cheaper and more readily available, and at the same time, you've described over the last 45 minutes the process of just this, trying to get this one idea down. It's obviously it's a huge undertaking. Companies are probably bringing in some really great minds on it. They're paying them the money that they deserve. They're getting them their health insurance, and putting a building up and making labs. Everyone's got cost in it. They probably have tried 150 million things prior to this that didn't work out, that we don't know about, that they had to fund too. And at the same time, they are making pretty amazing profits. So that's hard to argue with. But I guess the idea is if once they finally hit a product that works and it helps people and it's in the market and they're making money on it, then they lose their patent on it. Then they have to change the molecule a little bit so they can repatent it differently, so they can continue to market it, sell it, help people, make a profit, keep the company going for the next thing. It's maybe that's how something like C-peptide gets taken out at some point. Maybe it's just the company saying, hey, we have to change this molecule enough that it's something we can re-patent.
Yeah, well, again, this is an area of law that's really complex, and I can't say anything for sure about it, but I do know that they just changed the formulation of Lantus or whatever. I think it's the same company that makes Lantus. This Tojo thing.
Yes.
Which is totally not the Admiral of Japan in World War II.
They're running out of names for drugs, by
yeah,
the way. So,
but in any case, I think that was just making it 3 times more concentrated, right? So, and they did some studies to say that it might be better, but I think it was all inconclusive. But in any case, it was a new formulation, so it's this new thing, and it's got a new name, and I think that,
and here we go.
That renews some set of things. It might just be that it refreshes their marketing around it, which is actually a big part of the puzzle, and it's not something that is
talked about, I guess.
Yeah. So a lot of what keeps the new drugs pushing the old drugs off the market is just marketing, and not necessarily the IP considerations alone. So
well, it's interesting because I mean, if you take away, we've pulled a curtain back. If you put the curtain back and everything seems nice again, like on the surface, I can talk about it and say, I'm up for people doing anything because like my daughter uses an insulin that I don't think as many people use, and it works really well for her. And she tried others before that didn't work as well for her. So I like the idea that there's more and more and stuff to try. The reasons why it happens, I'm stuck between caring and not caring. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, what do I care why it happens as long as it's happening and we're getting different products and some of them might be better. And at the same time, not caring probably leads to a blind eye, and the blind eye probably turns into insulin costing way more than it should. And not just insulin, by the way, but other things like that. And so there's a line to walk between living your life and being an advocate, like, I guess, in the space. And you're steeped in one side of it pretty deeply, but at the same time you're a person living with diabetes, and if we go back a half an hour and listen to you say it again, like there was a point in your life where you were just like, look, I've got insurance, I ask for the insulin, it shows up, I give them $20 for it, and it's mine. So, and you have to admit it was probably more fun living like that than living like this now, right?
Well, I don't know, like a lot of what got me on this road was I looked at what the academic researchers were doing, and then I looked at what was on the market, and I said, I want some of the stuff that those academic researchers are doing, and I want to try it out. And I think I'm probably smart enough not to kill myself. So, and then I started to look at, there are things that have pretty good evidence that they work pretty well, and they still aren't a product. And why is that? And
why does that happen?
Yeah. So there's this idea that you mentioned a couple minutes ago, which is that you just kind of hand these large companies essentially free money, and that you can trust them to put that into research, and then you can trust them to go over everything that they research and bring the best of it to market. But I have not seen things work out that way. I've seen them take that free money that they're handed and put a lot of it into marketing to support their existing products, which is all told a much lower risk strategy. So you can kind of understand why they would do that. But and I've seen them give a lot of that money to their executives as well. But
it's funny what you just said. Go ahead, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So none of that actually is I think doing nearly as much as could be done to get the best research done and get the fruits of that research out to the patients. There are a lot of places in this process that exists where that gets sidetracked, and to the point where if I just look at what people are doing in university labs with way less funding, I see all of these amazing things that I think people should at least be able to try and can't yet. So how do we make that happen? I don't know. But
So playing devil's advocate for a second, and it's interesting because what you brought up is that so much money goes into marketing, right? So on one hand, having different companies in the same space is good because it spurs on everybody to do better, to keep trying, to try to beat each other. But then part of the idea of trying to beat each other and is they have to sell it at the end. And so then so much effort goes into marketing it that so little effort goes into the rest of it. It almost makes me feel like, to draw a strange parallel, but, like the DC Comics movies that are out now, like Suicide Squad just came out. And there was so much marketing into putting that movie onto into the world to make sure that people went and saw it. And you wonder, wouldn't they have just gone and seen it anyway had you just made a better movie? You know what I mean? Like if you would have put a quarter of the effort into making the thing as you put into making sure I'd go see it, maybe I would have just heard about it from someone else and gone on my own. And I wonder about that too. Like maybe if the drugs were just that much better and the insurance companies, the formularies and all that other crap wasn't in the way, maybe somebody would just hear from somebody else like, look, I use this insulin and to be honest, I don't get as many, I don't go on the roller coasters often. My blood sugar doesn't shoot up after I eat or whatever it ends up being. And then at the same time, I feel like I see the other side of it. Like I get it. Like we've got this drug, we put all this money into making it. We need to get it into hands. The more hands we get it into, the more money we make, the more we can do more things and but then it becomes what you're talking about too. And then then suddenly there's some guy at the top whose wife is driving around in a Mercedes on the company's dime or something like that, or that's probably the least of it, to be perfectly honest. It's just such a strange thing because, Anthony, I think that most of the innovation that exists in this country comes from capitalism. And at the same time, I can tell you that most of the roadblock to innovation in this country comes from capitalism. So what's the answer? You know what I mean?
Well, I think
you might not agree with me. I'm not sure.
I don't know. Like, I don't think I would say that the innovation comes from capitalism. I think that capitalism is really good, and capitalism could mean a million different things to a million different people. So I'll say that for what I mean right now is a system where you let market incentives determine the outcomes. I think that's really good at taking a bunch of known quantities and making small decisions to optimize the efficiency of what you're doing. But I don't think it's good for making big leaps and big changes in how you do things that could change how whole portions of the overall system works. Because, if you think of the invisible hand and where it's pushing you, it's this is a really kind of nerdy idea from like optimization theory, which is something I studied in college, but it's a really important idea, I think, for this discussion. Is that I think that, like, if you imagine you're on this landscape of possibilities and you're trying to get to the highest point on this landscape, the invisible hand of market forces is going to always lead you to look at where you're standing right now and head up. And so that's going to eventually lead you to the top of whatever hill you happen to start out on. And then you're going to get to the top of that hill and you're going to look around and every direction is going to be down. So you're just going to stay there. But if you stop looking just at your own feet and you look out across the landscape and try to see as far as you can and look around in every direction, you might find that there's another hill that is much higher, and you might have to walk down the hill you're on to climb up this other one that is a much higher one. And you have to endure that period of going down for a while, but you're going to be much better off in the long run. And that is something that market forces fight every step of the way, because as soon as you start trying to go down, they say, no, go right back up. You're going down. But actually, there's this longer term consideration in play where if you have to go down a while to get higher sometimes. So that's where I think taking these short-term incentives off of people and just letting them follow their own curiosity is really important. And that's what I think is the advantage of the hackerspace is you can do whatever you want, whatever crazy possibility you're interested in. If you're interested in it, like that's all that you need to get started. And you need to get the resources from somewhere, and that's another place where like the market forces are kind of fighting you. But um, uh, fundamentally, like you're in control of where you head on this landscape. And I think individual people are much better than any kind of bureaucratic organization or corporation is in looking out on the landscape and just seeing where their imagination says there might be the much higher summit that they could get up to. So I think we need to, and if we look at kind of the history of science, like I I'll have to find the historian of science who's actually documented this for you and get back to you. But the most vibrant periods of science and technology, I think, are the ones where you had a lot of small independent actors working on lots of different things. Fundamentally, science is experimental because it deals with uncertain things. So you just need to try lots of different things, and just having a few big organizations pushing a ton of resources after very few ideas probably isn't the best strategy for uncovering where the general region of the truth lies, because it's a big space that you're exploring, this space of all possibilities in some intricate technical field. So you need to spread out when you do that.
It seems like when it's one person driven by their own motivation and their motivation isn't to make money, then their motivation just seems to be to find good in what they're doing and do more good and find a way to do good better. And it just, as you're talking, I mean, obviously you can't wave a magic wand over the world and make a change, but if companies that made drugs, as an example, or things that helped people in general, I guess if those things were not privatized, if they were, I don't even know what to say. If they were an organization that was run like a business, but not like a business, and they could keep themselves going and keep doing good, then maybe we would find more things like what you're talking about, more small ideas that become big ideas, and ideas off in the distance that nobody's focusing on because there's no way to market it and package it and sell it.
Yeah. This is and this is actually in a way a pretty hot topic in like the what do we do about the economy, alternative economic space is like the idea of a basic income or something that would just free people up to some extent to do what they themselves determine they want to do, or to have at least some idea of at least some portion of your time is your own, and you don't have to spend all of your time
trying to get to the head of the rat race.
Yeah, or doing what you need to do for money. I think there's a lot of brilliant minds. I mean, this is something I'm aware of because I come from a kind of working class background, and the people around me, they were quite smart, but they were so like oppressed by the concerns of either trying to get money or trying to turn that into some sort of a status to get out of the straits they were in into slightly less desperate ones, that their minds were just they had the minds that could be contributing to something like science or the public good in some way, but they
spent their day making money to buy a loaf of bread so they could eat the bread so they could go back to sleep to get up in the morning and make more money to buy more bread.
Yeah, it wasn't quite a loaf of bread, but it was basically that they were looking at their own feet, and if you take a brilliant brain but the eyes are just looking down at the ground, nothing happens. So I think we need, whatever the mechanism is, we need to get people looking around at all the possibilities around them and working on that. And for that, you have to kind of free people up a little bit, and you can't just turn the screws on them with strongest possible economic incentives you can arrange.
It sounds such a, like what you just said made me feel like it'd be so cool if even just a pharma company would just put together, a couple of labs and make them like after hours accessible to their employees. Like, just to let them go in and tinker, like give them that freedom. Like maybe it's a person who can't pull themselves away from their 9 to 5 job because of their responsibilities, but would still love to be involved in things like you're talking about. And maybe it doesn't even have to stop at pharma companies or at science. Like, I don't know, just, you try to imagine all the people that work at a company who are great at social media in their personal life, but have nothing to do with your marketing department, while your marketing department's off spending all kinds of money trying to find a way to reach people. I find myself saying that a couple of times a year when companies contact me to talk about stuff. And it's funny that in the course of the conversation, what I recognize is that they're asking me, I have this big group of people and they all went to college for this one thing, and we can't reach as many people online as you do at home sitting in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. How does that happen? And what do you think, Scott? And then when you tell them what you think, they immediately say, most of them, there's some that haven't, but most of them say, well, that's not how we do it. And then they just discard your idea. And I was like, wow, so you asked, how do we break out of this cycle we're in? I give you an answer and you say, oh, that doesn't fit into our cycle though. It's just such an interesting,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just interesting how people's minds work. They're doing something that they know is repetitive and silly and getting them nowhere and costing them way more than it should. And the minute you say, well, yeah, try this, they go, well, no, that's not how it's done. It's just, it's people's minds work that way for reasons that not all people, but a lot of people's minds work that way. And it's maddening.
Yeah. I think that's just what happens when you put people in this context where everyone knows that things work a certain way and that there are consequences if you don't do things that way, and it has nothing to do with the results that you're getting, and you're not allowed to have your own agency and take your own initiative and take risks, and so that those people might have just been ticking off a box on the procedure that said, like, look into alternatives, and they looked into them, or who knows, or maybe they're just genuinely interested, but there's nothing they can do. So
I also think that sometimes you get into a job and you're a younger guy. We didn't ask you, you're married or you have kids or anything. I imagine you don't.
Yeah, actually I don't.
Okay, just because I imagine you don't, because you have a lot of time, and so
yeah, exactly. Well, I don't have a lot of time, but I would have I couldn't even think of doing this
right
otherwise.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
That happens like I was hoping that the hacker space would become this kind of neutral ground where people from the companies can go after hours and then meet up with people who are in academia and meet up with just random people who are interested and are not part of any institution. They could all come together and talk to each other, work together, see what happens. But the people from the companies are super busy because they lead this corporate life, and they probably do have families and kids, and like that's their life, that's it.
Yeah.
And
it's not that easy to walk away from once you've got a kid who wants to go to college and a house that they live in and a car that gets them to where they're going, and everyone needs to eat and have health insurance, and sort of maybe it is just a young man's game. Like the idea of pushing limits might be a younger person's thing, because I've spoken to people at companies. I just had a conversation recently. I hope the person's listening. Terrible at their job. Okay. And so but you realize towards the end of their career, look, I just got to come in here a couple hundred more times, not screw this up too much. I get a pension, I leave. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just trying to get to the end. And even that, Anthony, is understandable. You know what, on a human level, like, look, I've put decades into this. I'm almost done. I'm not screwing this up now with your fancy new idea that probably nobody's going to like, and I'm going to look like I'm the the author of this bad idea when it's over. And it's very simple to see how we get stuck into ruts like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Well,
easy to understand.
it's the wrong incentives for anything involving science, frankly. Uh,
Well, you were
you know,
making me think. You're making me think that it's just a podcast, but I started it a year and a half ago, maybe, and I was just initially trying to just branch my blog out, and I thought people weren't reading as much. I'll try a podcast. And now I might get an email or a note or a message daily from someone who's like, all I'm doing is listening to the stories on the podcast. And trust me, Anthony, I'm no great like diabetes like genius. We just talking to a lot of people who have type 1 diabetes, coming up with ideas, around, pre-bolusing insulin or changing basal rates or just kind of, how you think of your blood sugar. And I'm getting notes every day that say, my A1C went down a point. It went down a point and a half. It went down 2 points. My kid's A1C went down 2 points. And all I'm doing is listening to the podcast, being a little more aggressive with insulin or whatever it is we're talking about in the moment. And so it's my inclination to want to take that to more people. And how do you find those people? And then my first thought is, well, I guess I should find a company who wants to somehow, help me meet those people and get out into the world, because we're talking about going out into the real world, and that takes travel and it takes lodging and it takes time and it takes money. And it's funny. I'm realizing as I'm talking to you, I took this new idea of a podcast, this kind of a new way of reaching people. It worked. And then I'm trying to repackage it back into why the people looked for the podcast. And that made me sad just now. So you've made me sad, Anthony.
you answered your own question there, though. I think like
I did.
And coming from the Bay Area, I'm steeped in this culture of take your brilliant idea and make your own startup around it, and sometimes that is kind of used in disingenuous ways, but right now it sounds like you're already doing the right thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm again, and I just got done saying this the other day. My daughter's A1C is like spectacular right now, and it's even because of the podcast. It's because I've taken the time out to pause and talk kind of thoughtfully about diabetes management ideas. And you freeze your life for a minute to talk about this, not just try to figure out why a bolus didn't work while you're vacuuming the floor and the dog's throwing up on you and your son needs to be driven across town, but to actually stop for an hour and talk about it and think about it.
yeah.
And and now I'm thinking the podcast just may have helped me understand better how to make the podcast help people better, which is now a 3-level thought that almost confused me. But because of your yellness here, I'm feeling smarter, so I followed along. So.
Well, that's great. And if you came up with a pamphlet that summarized your recommendations, I would certainly buy that pamphlet, because one of the things that I don't spend a lot of time reading about, since I'm trying to grapple with all of these crazy things, is I barely worry about just like when I should take my bolus or really simple stuff like that.
Yeah, listen, Anthony. Here's my nickel's worth of free advice. And by the way, we don't give advice on the podcast, Anthony. We like to say that nothing you hear on the Juicebox podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. But just understanding how insulin works in your body and timing it better, it's just such a big deal. Like it really is. Being aggressive. When I don't know if you have a glucose monitor. They certainly make things. They like being aggressive much easier.
Yeah, I did when I could afford one.
Yeah, well, that's because see this, Anthony. You're spending all your free time not making money. We got to get you.
Yeah, well, no, that's the thing. Like,
no, it really is.
If you want to make money, like, you be corporate and you just don't screw it up and like kind of phone it in, and you'll get your money, and you can tinker around with the small things, but all of the really important possibilities, they're out of your reach now. So I don't think I don't think it's wise to make people face that choice, but facing that choice, I knew what choice I had to make. So
yeah, well, it's definitely not wise on a global, in a global sense. It just really isn't. maybe the reason we're not moving forward faster is because we're all focused on moving forward in ways that don't help anything but yourself, really. And I mean, listen, I'm sitting in a fairly nice house, and people listening to this podcast have probably been listening the whole time going, gee, Scott hasn't mentioned once that his wife works for a pharma company. But, you know, but I don't have a problem with it. My wife went to college. She wanted to be a doctor. She got out. She couldn't afford to apply to medical school. She took a job. She works in drug safety for a pharma company. She's worked at a number of them. I see how much other people's lives mean to my wife and how much her work is focused on keeping people safe and keeping people healthy. It's a real driving force for her. I just watched her, turn down some opportunities because she thought where she was helping more people. And so, I know the goodness in her heart. She's also not, one of the overlords at the top. And so, but at the same time, I have children and they have needs and they want clothes, and my son's getting ready to graduate from high school and he wants to go to college and he's a bright kid, and you know what I mean? Like all those things, they get you up in the morning to make money,
Yeah.
And so when I told you earlier, I see the other side of it. Like I really do see all the sides of it because I'm kind of living right in the middle of it. My daughter has type 1 diabetes and my wife works for a company who makes drugs. And so, I really do see I do see both sides of it, and there is no easy answer. That's for certain. I mean, on a regulatory level, obviously, if the government made better decisions about how it regulates things, I'm sure that would be an easy answer. But I'm assuming as long as money exists on the planet, that's not going to happen. So,
yeah. Well, we'll see. Yeah. Money can take many forms, and so can the institutions that grow up around it. So.
And that's what you guys are basically doing, is trying to make this take a different form, I guess.
Yeah. And the thing, one of the things, it's really encouraging to hear that your wife is doing good work, even in the context of an imperfect organization. But we've also had people come to us at the project who are, really frustrated that they can't do good work. And they're even at the lower levels. So that's also something where, like, I hope we can give people who want to do good work and can make the time for it an option. But also, it would be nice if, the corporations weren't quite so like total in their ambitions to exploit their human resources, and could actually give people the autonomy to determine what good work is.
Listen, I kept you way longer than I said I was going to, Anthony. I'm sorry for that. And I can hear my house starting. My house is starting to come alive again with people who are like, "He said an hour. I'm not staying in this room anymore." And so, but I really appreciate you doing this. This was way more enlightening than I imagined it was going to be, and I had some pretty high hopes for the conversation. So it means a lot to me that you took the time to do it. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure getting your perspective on things as well, and yours personally, and also what you can bring from talking to so many people in the community with so many different perspectives.
Yeah, I think it's important to hear everybody's perspective, and our lives living with diabetes is everyone's life's fairly similar. You hear people tell the stories, and on the surface they sound very similar, but then when you really start talking and you get into the details and you go long form like this, I think then you start hearing personal details that enlighten and help other people. So I really appreciate you coming on, especially it's earlier where you are. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you,
Anthony. Have a great day.
Yep.
Thanks for listening to the Juicebox Podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, please share it with a friend. Show them how to subscribe. Be a podcast buddy. I'm so sorry. I got an email right there. Bing, ding, bing. It's going to be something to delete in 2 seconds. Actually, watch this. Yep, I just deleted it. No one wants this. Unbelievable. Anyway, be a podcast buddy. A putty. A potty. Pud. There's really no good acronym in there for P buddy, PB, and J. Listen, if you like the podcast, tell a friend and show them how to get it, please. Also, if you're listening online, You know, you could get an app. If you got an iPhone, there's an app. It's already on your phone. Just look for it. It's called Podcast. There's a good one for Google and Android and iHeartRadio and Stitcher and any podcast aggregating app. Actually, you can just search Juicebox Podcast, and there it will be. Giant thank you to OmniPod for sponsoring the Juicebox Podcast. Go to myomnipod.com/demo with the links here in your show notes to find out more about your free, non-functioning, but totally wicked demo pod. Gonna be back next week with a football. Unbelievable. Who is playing me back in Words with Friends while I'm trying to do the... Oh, this guy kicks my butt all the time. I beat him twice, though, in the last couple of weeks. I'll tell you right now. I'm not sure who was more surprised, him or me.